Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on in 2020. So the big news today is that, well, there's a lot of news this week, but the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which I call Build Back Badly bill, passed the House. And what was unusual about it is that every single Democrat voted for it and every single Republican voted against it. Usually there's one or two or a few dissenters on one or the other side, but this was pretty unanimous. But the reasons for that were not so much what is in the bill, but politics for the November election. The Democrats need a talking point saying they got climate action passed and drug price reductions, even though those measures for climate action and drug price reductions are token at best. And the Republicans don't want the Democrats to have a talking point, even though the bill promotes climate denying boosts to the fossil fuel industry, which the Republicans are all about. So this had more to do with the politics in November than the substance of the bill. And, you know, the radical climate action and environmental justice groups have opposed this bill because it promotes fossil fuels. You know, for example, we've talked about this. They have to lease 2 million acres or square miles a year. And they have to do that before any public land is open or ocean is open for renewables, you know, offshore wind and onshore wind and solar. So it gives the fossil fuel industry, you know, first dibs, and basically, according to the Center for Biological Diversity, would lock in fossil fuel production, gas and oil, at current levels for a decade, which is a climate disaster. So among the groups opposing this, the Climate Justice Alliance, the Center for Biological Diversity, Food and Water Watch, Indigenous Environmental Network, those groups, you know, are at the grassroots. They're really fighting this, and they are advocating for the climate actions we need, not what's convenient for the Democratic Party. You know, it's noteworthy that not one progressive Democrat voted against this bill in the House. And Bernie Sanders didn't, when it was before the Senate, offer amendments to try to get rid of the fossil fuel giveaways and strengthen some of the healthcare and climate action provisions. And he got no support from Democrats in the Senate. As far as I can tell from reading the news, not one progressive Democrat offered similar amendments before it was voted on in the House. So it seems the progressives in the Democratic Party are more concerned with giving the Democrats a talking point for November than in giving voice to the radical climate and environmental justice movements. So just a little comment on this. Some more has come out this week. You know, there are 4 models out there from Rhodium, Princeton's Repeat model, Energy Innovations, and Moody's, and they all come in around 30 to 40% carbon reductions out of this bill. One of them says the range is as high as 44%, but they have, you know, really unrealistic assumptions, mostly having to do with that the private sector and state government and local government is going to do a lot in conjunction with this bill, which is, you know, really doesn't look like it's going to happen. But the other thing about it is the assumptions about carbon removal. It's like the International Panel on Climate Change. You know, we got to reduce carbon emissions at a certain time frame. What is it, 50% by or 45% by 2030? So that by the end of the century, we can, you know, or by 2050, we can be at net zero, and by the end of the century, starting to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. But that assumes massive implementation, development of carbon capture and sequestration, or even direct air capture and sequestration geologically. And those technologies are not there. And the money to do it. If you want to do direct air capture and sequester that carbon geologically, for example, by putting carbonated water, you take carbon out of the atmosphere, put it in water, put that in basalt rock formations, and over a couple of years that solidifies in the carbonates in the rock, in that porous basalt rock. They're doing that in Iceland, but it's very expensive. It can only be done if it's publicly subsidized. And there is some provisions in this bill that subsidize that at a price that they think will convince some companies to try to do it. But the overall, to get the 40% reduction, they're assuming that 1/6 or even 1/5 of all carbon reductions will come from carbon removal. That would be 13 times the current carbon removal capacity by 2030. There are only 12 carbon capture facilities in the US now, and all but one of them take that carbon and pump it into oil wells to enhance oil recovery. So it really doesn't remove carbon, it just enables them to get more oil to burn out of the ground that they fracked. So, and then to even get the carbon dioxide to where it can be sequestered or used in another way, they need 65,000 miles of carbon dioxide pipelines by 2050. Now, there's some proposals in the Midwest basically to take the carbon from biofuel capture as well as fossil fuel capture and bring it up to the Bakken oil field to pump it into oil wells so they get more oil out. But that seems like an unrealistic assumption, or else a massive infrastructure project that will lock us into fossil fuels for decades. So it just burns me up that the progressive Democrats and the more mainstream environmental NGOs, climate action NGOs, are calling this a victory. They're calling a defeat a victory. This is what's left of Build Back Better, and that's why I call it Build Back Badly, because it's really about fossil fuel infrastructure. The solar and wind incentives all go to corporations or wealthy consumers who can afford to use the tax credits for their electric vehicles. And then even, and the Indigenous Environmental Network has pointed this out, and by the way, let's put that article from the conversation on the projected emissions to get this carbon capture, to get this 40% reduction. And then the Indigenous Environmental Network has a nice set of slides showing the problems with this bill, particularly, or not particularly, but they do point out that, you know, the $60 billion in the bill supposedly for environmental justice projects are competitive grants that can be, and for all practical purposes will be, taken by for-profit corporations and the big NGOs. It's really not going to help the disadvantaged communities. And what they call clean energy in these so-called environmental justice projects, as well as through the whole bill, includes carbon capture and sequestration, nuclear power, biofuels, which you grow the crop that sequesters or grabs the carbon, but then you burn it and you put it back in the atmosphere. Fossil hydrogen, where you strip the hydrogen off of natural gas, and carbon markets for carbon offsets, which is a whole scam, and is basically the way fossil fuel industry is saying, well, we can keep burning carbon because we're going to offset it by growing a tree. And there's been a lot of scams about that. So that's what they call clean energy. So Indigenous Environmental Network and the other environmental justice groups are really complaining about that. So where are we? Well, the climate movement, and this includes the more mainstream as well as radical groups, is demanding that Biden declare a climate emergency, which would give him a lot of powers to do more than he has done. He had his chance. They all lobbied him. They met with him. He hasn't done it. I don't think we can expect that before the election. And then they want to vote down this side deal for easier permitting for fossil fuel projects. And I think it'll be interesting to see if the progressive Democrats in the House and Sanders in the Senate put up a real fight on the permitting bill. I'm skeptical, but we'll see it because the election's coming close and they don't want to muddy their message that they got something done. when they didn't really. So there was good news this week too. It was a bad week for Trump and his fascist movement, which is good news. The Trump endorsed election denying Republicans for governor, secretary of state, and attorney general in several states have won their primaries. And if they win the general election, that will enable the Republicans to steal elections. That's what they're aiming for. But overall, it was a bad week for Trump and his fascists. Monday, the FBI went to Mar-a-Lago and seized documents. And then on Wednesday, Trump had to sit for a deposition with the New York State Attorney General in the civil tax fraud investigation of the Trump Organization. And Trump took the Fifth Amendment over 400 times. I think that shows he's got something to hide, although it's kind of been hiding in plain sight to the rest of us for a long time. The insurance fraud, the bank fraud, the tax fraud, telling, the government his properties are worth a low number, and then telling insurance and banks in order to get loans that his properties are worth more than they really are. That's fraud in both ends. And then Thursday, the judge decided to release, and Trump said he wanted to see it released. I don't think he thought it would happen. The warrant to go in and grab documents, and the list of documents seized. And the warrant showed they're investigating 3 violations of the Espionage Act by Trump. And we know the documents included the highest security clearances, including reportedly from unnamed sources, documents related to nuclear weapons, which is kind of scary. I mean, it was always scary to have Trump around the nuclear button because he doesn't know shit really, and he's crazy. Now we have to recognize the Espionage Act is a problematic statute. It's been used particularly since the Obama administration, but right through Trump and now Biden, to prosecute whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, and now the journalist Julian Assange. And that's a threat to both the whistleblowers getting information out to the public that we ought to know, and the journalists like Julian Assange who takes that information and publishes it. It's not just Assange that's under threat by his prosecution, it's the New York Times and the Washington Post, although they don't seem to recognize it, even though they did publish stuff from him before, when was it? They got, I guess it was after the Chelsea Manning releases that they kind of pulled back. And the big problem with the Espionage Act is it doesn't allow for whistleblowers to mount a public interest defense. In other words, saying it was, better that the public got this information than that it remained secret for the public in the public interest. And Representative Rashida Tlaib has twice attempted to get that part of the Espionage Act amended. She tried in July to get it attached as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, and earlier in the year tried to get it attached to the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which was a House bill that was passed in response to Trump's abuses of pardon power in the insurrection on January 6th. And in both cases, the Rules Committee didn't even let it go to the floor for a vote. So the rest of Congress, the rest of the House hasn't had a chance to state where they come out on that. And by the way, the Rules Committee that squashed those amendments from Rashida Tlaib is chaired by a Progressive Caucus member, Jim McGovern of Massachusetts. So, it just shows even the progressive Democrats as a whole are not so damn progressive. And I'm going to put an article in the chat because, what the hell did Trump want to do with all this classified information? And David K. Johnston, a Pulitzer Prize journalist who teaches here at the Syracuse University Law School now, as well as continues to do journalism, has a column out saying the evidence suggests that Trump wanted to sell them for profit, like nuclear secrets to Saudi Arabia or something. So put that in the chat, and I think that's worth a read. So Monday they exercised a warrant against Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Wednesday, Trump pleaded the fifth 400 times in relation to the civil tax fraud investigation. And then on, when was it? Yeah, on Friday, there's also a criminal case against the Trump organization and its chief financial officer, Alan Weisberg, on these tax fraud charges. And so, what David K. Johnson suggests is that Trump wanted to sell this stuff for profit. So anyway, he's got a criminal case, a civil case, an espionage case, and they got the documents. They got the goods. It's about time that Trump got caught on financial fraud with respect to banks, insurance, and real estate taxes. It's been obvious for decades. David K. Johnson's written about that in a couple books. Now, the jury selection for this criminal trial on Trump's tax fraud charges, which is really aimed at Alan Weisselberg and the Trump organization, the jury selection is scheduled for October 24th, which means Trump organization will be on trial as we go into the November elections. And it couldn't happen to a better guy, as far as I'm concerned. So, I think that's good news, that the far right and its leader, Trump, needs their comeuppance for all the criminal activity they've been engaged in. And then there's good news on the ballot access end of things. North Carolina Green Party is on the ballot. Matthew Hoh will be on the ballot for U.S. Senate, and there are other candidates. There were two decisions this week, U.S. District Court and then the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected Democratic Party appeals to knock the Greens off the ballot. So the ballots had to start being printed up yesterday, I believe. So now finally Matthew Hoh and the Green candidates in North Carolina can turn to campaigning. In Missouri, I know the Greens turned in over 10,000 signatures. I haven't heard if they've been challenged. That was first of the month. And then in Pennsylvania, the Green Party petition was turned in. Nobody challenged. They're on the ballot. And I'm glad I was able to help them a couple weekends ago. It was close, but I guess it was good enough. So with that, I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments. Uniquely evil. Trump had so much to hide evidence. I wonder if he did. I believe they're talking, on the cable news. I saw it on MSNBC this morning. Did they really? Did the FBI get everything that's in Mar-a-Lago? It's apparent that Trump's lawyer really didn't have a clue what Trump had. And as one lawyer pointed out in that discussion, white collar criminals often don't tell their lawyers the full story, so they can try to control the narrative, which is what Trump always tries to do. So, there may be more evidence there. And, the FBI, I'm sure, is continuing to investigate, the Department of Justice to investigate and see if they have to execute another warrant if necessary. So, I wouldn't be surprised if there was more stuff at Mar-a-Lago that didn't get taken away by the FBI. Violent Content Boutique. Ralph Nader spoke up against self-driving cars. Any thoughts? Yeah, I saw Ralph's press release. The thing that struck out at me is that even Tesla admits the software kind of has screws up about every eight minutes, I think is what the number was. And so they're setting themselves up for a lot of suits for people that get killed, and Ralph points, what about a young child walking to school and the car, drives off the road and hits the child. So I think Ralph's got a good point, and he calls on the regulatory agencies to do their job. And as he always does, as they often don't. So I think Ralph brought up an important point. Amy L. Sachs. Howie, thoughts on the CDC, Center for Disease Control, basically promoting let it rip for multiple epidemics, pandemics, much like Trump did. Yeah, that's the point. He's not any, the Biden administration is not any different than the Trump administration at this point. Maybe a little different in there saying get your vaccines, it's important. Even Trump was saying that after a while. But public health measures like masking, and how long people have to or should or recommended to quarantine themselves if they test positive for COVID, and what they do after they get through now a 5-day period has all been loosened so much that, yeah, they're letting it rip. They're just telling people you're on your own, get your vaccination, and use your own best judgment when it comes to wearing a mask or keeping social distancing or staying out of situations where like crowds where you could get infected. I think it's terrible. There was a good article by David Wallace Wells, I believe his name is. He's an epidemiologist that in Minnesota who's written some good books. One called Big Farms Cause Big Flu, I believe, and the next one about the COVID pandemic was Dead Epidemiologists. He had an article out this week. Where did I read that? I can't remember. But you can probably find it by, searching the internet. And it was pretty scary in terms of where COVID is at, the likelihood that we're going to get a variant pop up that is deadlier than the Omicron variants are. And in any case, we have more infections now this summer than we did last summer. And we went through a very deadly winter. And, most of the epidemiologists say we're going to have it again this coming winter. Yet all the public health measures have pretty much been taken away, and they're just saying, get your vaccinations, which, people should, but they are not they're not fully protective. They're not as protective for Omicron as they were for the variants they were designed for, although they hope to come out in the fall with the Omicron specific vaccination or one that's more generic and includes Omicron. Yeah, I think it's totally a responsibility, and it's another example of the Democrats, instead of fighting the Republicans, caving to them, because it was the Republicans that pushed this thing that, the public health measures are taking our freedom, and, the more extreme elements saying, COVID is a plot by the New World Order to take our freedoms and that kind of nonsense. And the Democrats, instead of fighting it and fighting for public health measures and explaining why we need them, just said, yeah, we're getting rid of them too, just to take it off the table as a election issue. And they pretty much have. I mean, politically, they've succeeded in doing that. COVID is not a top issue now. But it is, like I've said, many people have said, we may want to get rid of or forget about COVID, but COVID hasn't forgotten about us. And, now we got monkeypox, and the general prognosis from epidemiologists is that with the climate changing and habitat being destroyed, there's going to be more leaps of viruses that are in animals into the human population that we don't have the immune protection from. So it's a dangerous situation, and we're not investing in public health. That was cut, started with Obama, cut radically by Trump. So we don't even have the public health infrastructure in place to deal with these public health problems. And now we got, this anti-vaccine craze, and we got polio coming back. We had a case in Rockland County here in New York. Now they found it in the sewage in New York City, the virus, the polio virus. And there are a lot of people, because of this vaccine skepticism, who are not vaccinated against polio. And believe me, when I was coming up, I knew a number of kids that got polio. And, they lost the use of arms or legs. It can be paralyzing. It can be deadly. And, it's real. But, people saying, well, we can't have vaccine mandates. What, we're going to get rid of the mandate that children going to public school should have their polio vaccination? We're basically inviting these very dangerous diseases back into our populations. We thought we had eradicated polio. What about some of these other deadly diseases? Smallpox. It's supposedly not out there except in labs for study. But I think the skepticism and disregard for science on the part of so many people, not just the far right, that's their MO. They want to say there's no such thing as evolution, COVID, climate change, and that kind of thing. But there are a lot of sort of new agey types on the left that don't really believe in science either. And, so it's become a problem. So I'm not happy that the Biden administration has basically taken the Republican approach and said COVID's over when it's not. Violet Content Boutique. Howie, do all the heat pump systems require buying a grill underground? I have a dried up lake 5 feet under this house. No, you can have window systems, kind of like a window air conditioner, that do it without taking heat from underground. And the grill is, basically a circulating pipe that goes underground where in the summertime it's cooler and in the wintertime it's warmer than what the air is. But they're heat pumps that act just like refrigerators, pumping the heat one way and the cold the other way. So you don't have to invest in that underground type of heat pump. The big problem with either system is that it costs a lot of money up front, and that's hard for a lot of people. We need to publicly finance these systems being installed so that people pay back the cost over many years based on the difference in their bills. Because once you have these systems introduced, you just pay for the electricity. You don't have to pay for the fuel, whether it's, natural gas or propane or heating oil. And that difference saves you money, and you can use that savings to pay back the cost over time. And maybe the government should also just grant some of that money. So it's, even more incentive and to get this conversion away from fossil fuel heating and cooling to electrified heating and cooling, and electricity hopefully coming from clean energy sources. So, heat pumps. Bill McKibben had a good column when the Ukraine war broke out called Heat Pumps for Peace and Freedom, I think. And, it's basically saying, the US and Europe should really push to get heat pumps installed in Europe as fast as possible so they are less dependent on gas from Russia. And I think to some extent they're doing that, but not as fast as we'd like. ROGB. Hi all, what do you know about the super flammability of EV car batteries and possible remedies with solid state and maybe graphene batteries? I don't know. I really can't comment on that because I'm just not that familiar with the battery technology and the flammability concern with the batteries that they're using. But it sounds like you do. It sounds like you know what the possible remedies are to that problem. But I can't say more than what I just said. But you got my interest, my curiosity piqued, so I will be looking into that this week. Violet at Content Boutique. Howie, have you seen those machines that extract humidity from the air to produce water? I have not. I mean, dehumidifiers I'm familiar with. And I'm not sure what the purpose of this is. Is it to produce water in dry climates, which don't have much humidity in the air? I wonder, why get your water that way rather than from, reservoirs, lakes, streams, rainwater. So again, we have to look that up too. Okay, comments on Pelosi's Taiwan trip and the fallout. Well, why Pelosi had to do this at this time when there's already tension in a war in Ukraine. And the Chinese response was predictable. It was kind of sort of challenging them in their claim to Taiwan. The world recognizes Taiwan as part of China, but also most of the world kind of wants what supposedly was going to protect Hong Kong's democracy, one country, two systems. And that's been, going okay. It doesn't seem like China wants to invade and impose its government on Taiwan, at least not in the immediate term. So, why did Pelosi want to poke that hornet's nest? Didn't seem like a smart move to me. And the fallout is, China's doing these war games. They've encircled Taiwan, showing that they could blockade Taiwan in the event of a war. And they did it for 5 days and then said, we're going to keep doing it for a few more. So, and then the U.S., of course, has to respond, and they bring some aircraft carriers closer. And while I don't think anybody wants to start a war, when you have ships in close vicinity and aircraft flying around, the decision, doesn't happen at the top level. It could happen there at the ground level. And a misunderstanding or, a cowboy on one side or the other starting something, the thing could spin out of control. And these are two nuclear powers. So, I don't think it was smart on Pelosi's part. And, what China did in response also, and this is something that we need to diplomatically, try to rectify, is they said, okay, we're not going to talk to you about military matters, including nuclear disarmament. We're not going to talk to you about climate change. We're basically not going to talk to you about anything constructive. And that was China's response to Pelosi's trip, which wasn't constructive, but that's what they did. And shouldn't be a surprise to Pelosi because China is very sensitive about Taiwan. So those are my comments. I think at this point, the U.S., rather than projecting competition with China in a belligerent way, should be saying, look, we have human rights concerns about several things going on in China, but we need to talk about nuclear disarmament and climate in particular, but also the world economy. So it doesn't make sense for us to be, having this hot war or cold war of words. We need to get practical and agree to disagree on some things, but work on other things where we might agree. Violet Contact Boutique. Howie, the polar caps are moving, may reverse. Any thoughts? I think you mean the magnetic poles. That has, it does happen periodically in Earth's history. And the magnetic poles have moved some, but that's one of those things that we can't do much about, except be prepared for when it happens. And I've read about this, but I can't remember at the moment. There will be ramifications, I think, for, maybe our, electronic communications through the air, for navigation. So I'm not sure what the consequences are, but I think the only thing we can do is, be prepared for when it may happen. There's a regular cycle, and I forget what the time is, just off the top of my head, 87,000 years or something like that. And we're kind of due for it. So, but, it could happen now, tonight, or it could happen, 10,000 years from now. I don't think the science is sharp enough on that question to give us a better prediction. Comments on Rushdie attack. Well, it's terrible. He's being attacked for, speaking his mind under the fatwa of, the Ayatollah of Iran. And I don't know if they've identified the attacker, but, it was probably somebody who was listening to that, religious zealotry. And all I can say is, they should have better security for him. So this guy couldn't get up and stab him several times. And I'm not sure. I know he was in the hospital. I'm not sure whether he's in stable or critical condition. I'm concerned because this is another attack on free speech. This time from a right-wing religious government in Iran, at least motivated by them in all likelihood. But the U.S. Doesn't have clean hands on this either, because we're going after Julian Assange for publishing leaked documents, which all newspapers do. The Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, they do it almost daily. They get information leaked, either documents or often people speaking off the record, people who know what's going on but don't want to be identified because they're not supposed to be talking, but they think the public ought to know. So the assault on Assange is an assault on the whole press. And that should concern us as much as, Iran's, the fatwa, they want somebody to kill Rushdie. And there's a lot of money available to whoever does it or their family if they get caught in prison or executed. So it's a terrible thing. Via email. What should the climate movement be doing now that the Dems have passed a dead-end climate bill that is funded for 10 years, meaning they're unlikely to follow up anytime soon? Well, I think we got to demand that whoever's in Congress follow up soon. We need to be running our own candidates against Democrats that don't follow up. We got to make it an issue and keep pushing. We can do things at the state and local level and build momentum for the eco-socialist Green New Deal that we really need. The demand that Biden do a climate emergency, that's fine. I called for it during the presidential campaign. Of course, I was saying I would do it. I wasn't just demanding that Biden do it because, you give these ideas to the Democrats and they water them down and screw them up. But that's what the climate movement is demanding. And, the other thing is see if we can stop this permitting bill that will enable things like the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which will take frack gas from West Virginia through down to Virginia and North Carolina, mostly for export. That gas should stay in the ground. We got in the pipeline from wells already drilled enough gas, enough oil to use, that we need to use during the transition to 100% clean energy. And that's coming from the International Energy Agency, not the most radical group. It's an intergovernmental body that was set up during the energy crisis in the early 70s, generally pretty conservative, but they're just looking at the climate science and saying, we got enough gas and oil. We don't need any more projects. Yet this bill would streamline the permitting, which is where we're able to stop a lot of these things. So that's important. That's coming up as soon as the House gets back in session at the end of the month. So I think that's probably the most immediate thing. And then longer term is we got to keep pushing for a eco-socialist Green New Deal. In other words, not just give money to corporations to incentivize them building clean energy or stopping the release carbon. We need to do it through the public sector, just like we did during World War II to turn industry on a dime into what FDR called the arsenal of democracy to defeat the fascists. We need to do nothing less through the public sector to defeat climate change, because the complex transition requires coordination, massive investment, and the for-profit corporations, each one acting on their own for their own bottom line, are not going to get it done. I don't care how many incentives you give to them. So that's what we got to keep pushing for. And that's why we need the Green Party, because except for the very left fringe of the Democratic Party, they're not doing these things. And even them, AOC and those people, their Green New Deal is kind of a Keynesian trickle-down incentives for the corporate sector, not much through the public sector. They do have some smaller bills like the Green New Deal for public schools and the Green New Deal for public housing, which are good, are through the public sector, but they're just a fraction of what we need to do. And even particularly the housing bill, to me, is way short. It's about retrofitting and rehabbing existing public housing. Nothing about expanding public housing, which we need to do to house the homeless and the people that are being squeezed by these sky-high rents, so everybody has an affordable option. To do that, they got to repeal the Faircloth Amendment that was passed during the Clinton administration when Andrew Cuomo, now disgraced governor of New York, was head of housing and urban development. And it says that you can't build new public housing units. You can only replace those that are torn down, which means less than 1% of the housing in this country is public housing. It needs to be something more like 30% to basically create a sector that makes the private housing market have to compete with it, and that'll bring down rents across the board. That's what we've advocated. And the public housing, or the Green New Deal for housing or public housing, whatever it's called, doesn't do that. What it does do is, okay, the public housing we got does need to be rehabilitated, including for energy efficiency and clean energy. But the public housing sector needs a lot more. We need a lot more public housing that is green. So even there, the progressive Democrats they're not eco-socialists. They're kind of, New Deal liberals at best. And that's not going to get it done in time to deal with this climate crisis. Kevin Sanchez, do you think the main economic problem in this particular class of wealthy is this particular class of wealthy elites or the capitalist system itself? Well, the main problem is the system itself, just its structural tendencies to grow without limit and destroy the environment, to exploit labor as much as it can and increase inequality, and for capitalist states to compete with each other for cheap labor and markets and resources, which leads to war. So all that's within the system itself. Those are fundamental. Now, this particular class of wealthy elites, yeah, I think it's worse than in the past. As capitalism has become, in the United States, more monopolized or oligopolized, and as we become more segregated by class, particularly in the larger urban areas, 50, 100 years ago, the local capitalists that owned a manufacturing plant in town lived in the community and went to civic organizations, the Masons, the Elks, whoever, and mixed it up with working class people. They knew each other. Now they're segregated. They don't know working class people. They dehumanize them in their mind. And that's why, in fact, Ralph Nader pointed this out in his column this week. He pointed out that when he was going to school in the 1940s, in public school, the average CEO of a corporation made 12 times what the average worker in that company did. Today, it's over 300 times. And he said back in the 40s, any CEO that tried to pay themselves 300 times what the average worker made would have been ostracized by not just, people in the working class, but by other capitalists. They'd say that's just beyond the pale. There were norms. That's what Nader was writing about, how a lot of civic norms have been replaced by commercial norms. And that's what we got now, because those capitalists that pay themselves 300 times or more, they don't have to interact with working class people, even middle class people. They're off in their own segregated, gated community with the very elite. And they don't even feel, what they're doing to their fellow human beings. They're just an abstraction to them. So this particular capitalist class, I think, is worse than the ones we've had in a lot of respects. And of course, the increasing monopolization of wealth is part of a dynamic of capitalism. So you could say the production of this worse capitalist class is a tendency of capitalism itself. But I think, when we, think about what we're going to do politically, we don't just say we got to get rid of this or that capitalist. Elon Musk is an asshole and Donald Trump is an asshole. If we could only get rid of them, no, we got to change the system, because this system produces Donald Trumps and Elon Musks and Jeff Bezos's and Bill Gates. So these people have put commercial values over civic values, as Ralph Nader was discussing. So the main problem is the system itself. Violet at Content Boutique. An African-American socialist group was raided by the FBI in New York and other places. Any thoughts? It was African People's Socialist Party. It was in Florida and Missouri, not New York. And, I don't know if the FBI tried to get the documents they were seeking or the information they were seeking by subpoena before they got a warrant and raided these premises. And, reading the accounts, they were maybe over, They went in there with, pretty aggressively. And that's a concern, because there's a whole history of the FBI repressing Black liberation groups. Martin Luther King, the Black Panther Party, COINTELPRO, that was under J. Edgar Hoover. Hopefully the FBI is not as bad as it was under J. Edgar Hoover, but we keep hearing during the War on Terror, they went after Muslim people and appear in a lot of cases to have set them up for terrorism charges that those people never would have gotten near if they hadn't been egged on by FBI informants and infiltrators. So there's a lot to be concerned about. On the other hand, is this really a socialist group? One of them, Black Hammer, back in December was joining up with the Proud Boys in, I don't know what, but, they, in that group is under investigation for the death and kidnapping charges with their own members. Now, that group split off from the African People's Socialist Party, which has been around forever, small group. They have a white support group called the Uhuru Movement. And they have, civil rights, but also what's come out in this, which is concerning, is that they accepted money from Russian sources for election campaigns in St. Petersburg, Florida. They're small donations, $3,000 something, but that's still illegal. Accepted full payment for trips to Russia. And basically their position on the Ukraine war is Russia's defending itself, which I find, absurd. They sort of take the position that the enemy of my enemy, U.S. imperialism, is my friend. So whatever Russia wants to do, it's in conflict with the U.S., is good by them. I think that, get you in bed, your friends become some god-awful right-wing people. But that's their politics. So those are my thoughts. I think, their due process rights, civil rights, if they're charged, fair trial. I don't know if they're going to be charged for accepting money for an election. We'll have to see. At this point, the purpose of the FBI warrants was to get evidence against a Russian named Ionov, who heads this sort of AstroTurf group called the Global what is it? Global Movement for Global Anti-Globalization Movement, or what, World Alliance. Anyway, it's the Anti-Globalization Movement. I forget the proper name of it. And they hosted a conference in 2014 to which some so-called left-wing groups in the U.S. went, as well as a lot of neo-fascist groups from Europe and the United States, including the League of the South, which is a racist white supremacist organization. And I guess these leftist groups justified that on the basis of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And if they're against U.S. imperialism and for Russia, which is against U.S. imperialism supposedly, then we're with them. And these groups included the United National Anti-War Coalition and the International Action Center, which is associated with the Workers' World Party. And to this day, they defend going to that conference where they were, sitting jowl by jowl with fascists. And, that's what this position that the enemy of my enemy is my friend will get you into. You'll be aligned with fascists. So I have, a lot of political problems with, the African People's Socialist Party and its perspective. Certainly Black Hammer, which is now carousing with the Proud Boys. But on the other hand, any group, and I would defend the right-wing group, their due process rights, their civil liberties should be respected. And if they were violated in these raids by the FBI, then they should sue and try to get that rectified and get compensation for it. But I don't know enough of the details and what their complaints would be to say, whether they have a case. So those are my thoughts. Eric Gray, thoughts on the distrust that outspoken parents have toward teachers in terms of seeing their children think differently than them politically. Yeah, differently, who is them, the teachers or the parents? Because, we do know of parents criticizing teachers. I read this week and this wasn't a teacher, this was a school. A teacher put up posters of Martin Luther King and Harriet Tubman in the classroom, and the school staff ripped them down, saying they were upsetting to the children, causing division or something. And that teacher resigned because the teacher didn't want to work under those kind of circumstances. So, you have some parents complaining about critical race theory or about evolution or talking about sexuality that acknowledges there are people who aren't or heterosexual. And so, and then when the children, think differently than the parents get upset with the teachers, I guess. And then you got it working the other way where the parents have the children, challenging the teachers. I guess it becomes a political issue in the classroom. So, how do you deal with that? I think, everybody should be able to have their say in a way that, is where you can have a real discussion of the issues and the positions, rather than what tends to happen like in school board meetings is, you give people in the audience, 30 seconds or a minute or even 2 minutes to speak, and they really can't lay out much of the position. So they go on rants and throw accusations around, and it just gets all heated. Lots of heat, but no light. So we've got to have forums in which these issues can be, talked through, and people with very different points of view can at least understand each other and see the other side as coming from an honest place, or maybe not, exposing them as coming from having another agenda and another axe to grind. And they're using this situation as a way to advance an agenda that really doesn't have to do with teaching our children. So that was kind of long-winded. I guess that's the best I can do with the question as it was phrased. saw a question pop up, but maybe I answered it before. It was via email. So is that it? I guess you got my label up there. So, well, to wrap up this week, I think it was a pretty good week, actually. Even though the Build Back Badly bill did pass without any dissent, a lot about it was exposed for the climate movement. We know what we need to do. We need to try to stop this permitting bill, and then move on and keep running our own people and putting our own program out there for the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal to really get to 100% clean energy and zero emissions in a decade, and beyond that to repaying the climate debt this country owes to the world. As the Fair Shares Group, our analysis shows, we not only have to get to 100% or zero carbon emissions, we really need 175% reduction by the end of the decade to contribute our fair share to the world. And the way we do that is by helping countries in the global south, build their clean energy systems so they don't have to go through the 19th century fossil fuel era. They can go straight to the 21st century solar era and also mitigate some of the damage that has already been done by climate change. So we know what to do there. And then, Trump looks like he may get his comeuppance. It's way past time, and we got a couple more Green parties anyway on the ballot for this year, North Carolina and Pennsylvania. And good work to those people in those states. And so, as I say often, the best thing all of us can be doing is, strengthening and taking action through our local Green Party chapters. That's got to be the grassroots base and power for what we get done at the state and national level. You just can't do it on top with, a personality or one presidential campaign. It's got to be a movement at the grassroots and challenging for power, first of all, at the local level. And that creates a foundation, a platform for moving up to the state level and the House of Representatives. And that's really got to be our strategic perspective. So I'll leave you with that, and hope you have a good week, and we'll see you next week.